If I have to pick one place, it's Algeria, because having followed Algeria for a few years, is what you get is a real sense of generalized frustration, and that's similar to that's the most similar to Tunisia, in that people. I mean, it's an incredibly badly run country. It's a very wealthy country, but the wealth doesn't. It's an oil-producing country, but the wealth has never really trickled down. There's enormously high unemployment. There's the core of the regime, which is the military, has started to fall apart slightly, and you've seen, the regime is fragmented essentially between President Bouteflika and the military, and I think that has potential. But considering Algeria's history, both recently the civil war, but also back as far back as the 60s, that could get very, very ugly. I mean, there we're talking about another civil war.
So, Senator, if I had to suggest, who might be next, I think Jordan is a very interesting case in this respect. Not in the same way as Tunisia. I don't think there would be total regime change. The monarchy and the king still have enough legitimacy to survive in Jordan. But I think what you might have happen is something similar to 1988, 1989, where riots and protests about economic conditions forced King Hussein to initiate a democratic transition. And actually, for a while, it seemed very promising. Jordan was really one of the more fascinating cases in terms of, moving forward with democratization. It didn't last long. I could be wrong about this, but if I recall, Jordan has had, in 1992, it had the highest Freedom House scores of any Arab country. It had a 3-3. Mm-hmm. In any case, so I think that's the other model. It's not only revolution or status quo. I think there's a middle option where if leaders see enough pressure from their own citizens, they might say, well, let's preempt their anger and initiate a more democratic political system that incorporates the opposition, holding reasonably fair elections, and so on, which is what you had happen in Jordan in 1989. Of course, the king still sort of stood above all of that and had the final say and veto power over decisions, but at least it seemed to be going in the right direction. So if we're looking at sort of a gradualist model of political change, I think that is a promising one. As for Egypt, I'm glad that you said that we're talking more about a 2 or 3 year timeline. If that's the case, that gives the U.S. a little bit more time to reorient its policy towards Egypt. Revolution is not going to happen tomorrow there. That said, again, that's what we said about Tunisia on December 15th, and look what happened. So I think the major takeaway should always be never assume that a revolution is not going to happen very, very soon, because you know what? It just might. And it's not just the revolution, it's what happens after. It's about having a long-term vision, because we don't want to see one autocracy just replaced with another. And that's where I think the international community has a very important role to facilitate democratic transitions and to provide technical expertise, for example, when it comes to reassessing electoral frameworks and things of that nature. So I think there's definitely a role for the West to play. The question is, does it want to play that role? Is it ready to play that role? And we haven't even talked about the big kind of elephant in the room, surprisingly, which is the so-called Islamist threat. Regimes are always going to play the Islamist card and say, you guys really want democracy? Well then, what happens if the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power? Is that what you want? Yeah. So we might return to that kind of debate when it comes to a country like Egypt.
Sure. I mean, I think that countries like Jordan and Morocco, in a sense, being monarchies, have more leeway because the kings in both countries keep a certain distance from the everyday politics, and can launch reform project have still had that authority. If they're and I think what you have to remember is that whether it's a king or a president, actually, decisions from the top can be implemented, and not just when they're repressive, but also when they're progressive, when they're about reforming the system. In countries like Morocco or Jordan or Egypt that have a serious problem with human rights and torture, for instance, I do think that the existing regimes, if they make the decision, can reverse it. I mean, we saw this with in Morocco in the late 90s, when under the previous king, when we went from a extremely repressive Tunisia under Ben Ali-like country to a relatively more open country with a lot less police brutality. So things, like you said, can get underway without a change in actual leadership.